Recently, on October 18th, President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the rebel group known as the FARC, marked the one-year anniversary of their agreement to hold peace negotiations that would put an end to a conflict that has lasted over 50 years and cost an estimated 600,000 lives. While there have been many prior efforts to find a negotiated peace to what has been an immensely bloody conflict, this appears to be the first time in decades that negotiations might actually bring about peace in the near future. The Colombian government and the FARC have agreed to negotiate 6 issues: land reform, political participation, demobilization of the rebels, a solution to the drug trafficking problem, restitution to victims of the 50-year armed conflict, and putting the agreement to a national referendum. About 3 months ago, the negotiators announced that the first issue, land reform, had been resolved and that the negotiations would move on to the next issue on political participation. The initial agreement on land reform is an important milestone for a country that, according to official statistics, has the most unequal land distribution in the world, with 87% of peasants who have no land title at all. President Santos called the agreement on land issues, quote, a fundamental step towards a final accord to put an end to a half-century of conflict. His head negotiator, Humberto de la Calle, expressed himself similarly.
La piedra angular del acuerdo es la reafirmación de la dignidad de la familia campesina. Un cambio histórico, un renacimiento del campo colombiano que puede darse en el escenario del final del conflicto armado.
It is the inequality in land distribution that lies at the root of Colombia's civil war, which is also the longest civil war in recent Latin American history. The peace negotiations, for which the recently deceased president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, was instrumental in getting started, are currently taking place in Cuba and also at times in Norway. The head negotiator of the FARC, Iván Márquez, emphasized Chávez's role.
El presidente Chávez y Venezuela se la están jugando por la paz de Colombia y por la paz en la región. Nosotros no tenemos sino palabras de agradecimiento con el presidente Chávez.
The governments of Venezuela and Chile, a leftist and a right-wing government, respectively, are functioning as guarantors of the peace process. So far, 15 cycles of negotiations have taken place, and the parties are now discussing the terms for an agreement on the second point on political participation.
Este acto de cierre de un ciclo temático es al mismo tiempo la apertura al trascendental debate en torno a la democracia colombiana.
Colombia's President Juan Manuel Santos recently highlighted the importance of reaching an agreement on the second topic by November 18, which represents the one-year anniversary since the talks began in Cuba.
Yo espero que de aquí a allá podamos dar nuevos resultados. Podemos mostrarle al pueblo colombiano que estamos avanzando. Es importante por el bien del proceso. Yo quiero llegar a unos acuerdos lo más pronto posible para que nunca más vuelvan a haber víctimas en Colombia.
This second point of talks would deal with the rights of the FARC to re-enter Colombia's political process, their access to the media, and guarantees for their safety. One of the conditions for the negotiations, however, is that all preliminary agreements are kept confidential, so as to keep objections to the agreement from within the two camps during the negotiation process at a minimum. It is thus not possible to know exactly what has been agreed to so far. The point about guaranteeing the safety of demobilized FARC combatants is a key issue because in a peace agreement that was reached in 1990, demobilized rebels were later assassinated by the hundreds, which is also why it has taken so long to build trust and to find a new path towards peace negotiations. Given the history of failed peace negotiations in Colombia, it has been surprising to many observers of Colombia that President Santos should be so optimistic about reaching an agreement. Not only Santos has been optimistic, but so has the Colombian population, which, according to a poll conducted by RCN television last year, 77% of the population support the negotiations, and 54% believe that they will lead to an agreement. The reason for why this seems to be the most promising effort for a peaceful resolution to this 50-year conflict is that both sides, the government and the rebels, seem to be clearer than ever that neither side can win the conflict by force of arms. That is, both sides are in a weaker position than they were just a few years ago and need a success in the negotiations in order to maintain their legitimacy. The FARC has been weakened due to the recent loss of many of its most important leaders. The government is in a weakened position because its conservative camp, which has governed Colombia for the past 12 years, is hopelessly divided between a reactionary right wing, represented by former President Álvaro Uribe, and a more neoliberal right wing, represented by the current president, Juan Manuel Santos. Uribe is more connected to the country's landed aristocracy, its drug barons, and their brutal paramilitary forces. As such, he is completely opposed to the peace negotiations and to having friendly relations with neighboring Venezuela.
El tema es un tema de gobierno, un gobierno que ha dejado deteriorar la seguridad, un gobierno que acabó el diálogo con el pueblo colombiano y lo sustituyó por el diálogo con el terrorismo. El presidente Santos era el más duro opositor a la dictadura chavista para ganar votos y ahora en el gobierno nos ha sorprendido, aparece como el gran patrocinador de la dictadura chavista, como aquel que legitimó a Chávez como promotor de la paz con unos terroristas que Chávez siempre ha protegido.
Santos, on the other hand, is more connected to the country's urban aristocracy and its industrial class, for whom an end to the civil war would improve the country's conditions for conducting business, and for which a land reform would not mean the end of their privileges. Despite the constant sniping from Uribe, a former boss and mentor of President Santos, it is clear that Santos is hoping to finalize a peace agreement before the presidential election in the middle of next year, so that the agreement could serve as a feather in his cap for his re-election campaign. While enormous uncertainties remain and the process could still be derailed at any time, the fact remains Colombia simply has no other option than a negotiated settlement.